There's a pattern that shows up in business psychology research. CEOs who build billion-dollar companies sometimes lose everything, not because they stopped working hard or became lazy, but because they kept doing exactly what made them successful in the first place. Kodak invented the digital camera in 1975. The company held the patent. They understood the technology. But leadership decided not to pursue it because film was profitable and digital wasn't yet. 15 years later, they filed for bankruptcy. The same minds that built an empire couldn't see the shift happening right in front of them. This isn't about stupidity or incompetence. It's about how success rewires your brain's pattern recognition system. When something works repeatedly, your brain forms what cognitive psychologists call a success schema. It's a mental shortcut that says, this approach succeeded before, so it's the right approach now. The more times that shortcut proves correct, the stronger the neural pathway becomes. Success literally makes certain ways of thinking automatic. But here's what makes this particularly tricky. That same mental shortcut that helped you build something exceptional becomes the barrier preventing you from seeing when the rules change. Blockbuster's leadership saw Netflix coming. They had multiple opportunities to buy the company for $50 million. Their executives reviewed the proposal. They understood streaming was possible. But their entire mental framework was built around late fees and physical locations. That framework had generated billions in revenue. Every quarterly report confirmed they were right. So when someone suggested abandoning that model, their brains treated it as noise, not signal. Research on cognitive flexibility shows that expertise in one domain can actually decrease your ability to recognize valid alternatives. When you've solved a problem successfully many times, your brain stops searching for other solutions. It's efficient, but it's also limiting. This plays out in a specific way with high achievers. Success creates what some researchers call competency traps. You become so good at executing one strategy that you lose the ability to evaluate whether that strategy still makes sense. Your brain interprets the suggestion to change as a threat to your identity, not information about your environment. The psychological mechanism here involves something called commitment escalation. Once you've invested heavily in a particular approach, and that approach has paid off, any evidence against it gets filtered through a confirmation bias that's been reinforced by years of positive outcomes. You don't consciously decide to ignore warning signs. Your perception system has been trained to not recognize them as warnings. Nokia dominated mobile phones in the early 2000s. They had 40% market share globally. When touchscreens emerged, their engineers built prototypes. But leadership believed physical keyboards were essential because that's what users wanted. They had the data. They had the market research. Every metric confirmed their belief, right up until the iPhone shifted the entire category and Nokia's market share collapsed within 3 years. The pattern isn't that these leaders were arrogant or stupid. It's that their brains had optimized for pattern matching in a stable environment. When the environment changed, their pattern recognition system kept looking for the old patterns. There's a related effect called functional fixedness, where your brain can only see objects or ideas in terms of their familiar use. A hammer is for hitting nails. A business model is for generating revenue the way it always has. When someone suggests using the hammer as a doorstop or rebuilding the business model from scratch, your brain experiences genuine difficulty processing that suggestion as valid. But here's where this gets more nuanced. This cognitive pattern isn't always destructive. Sometimes, maintaining your strategy despite external noise is exactly what's needed. Sometimes, what looks like a threat is just distraction. The challenge is distinguishing between legitimate environmental shifts and temporary market fluctuations. Psychologists studying decision-making under uncertainty have found that successful people often credit their judgment for outcomes that were partly due to luck or timing. This creates a feedback loop. You believe your mental model is accurate because it predicted success, so you trust that model more completely, which makes you less likely to update it when new information arrives. The uncomfortable part isn't that this happens to billionaires or CEOs, it's that the same mechanism exists in everyone. Anytime you found a solution that works, your brain starts to prefer that solution over alternatives. The more success you experience with it, the harder it becomes to see other options. Someone who's been in a relationship for 20 years develops patterns for resolving conflict. Those patterns worked well enough to keep the relationship stable. But if the relationship's needs change, those same patterns might become obstacles. The person isn't being stubborn necessarily. Their brain has literally been trained to default to what worked before. A teacher who's been using the same lesson plan for a decade might struggle to adopt new methods, not because they're resistant to improvement, but because their teaching framework has been validated by years of positive feedback. Even if newer methods would be more effective, the brain's pattern recognition system keeps suggesting the familiar approach. The research on this shows up in studies of organizational behavior, where companies with strong cultures and proven track records are statistically more likely to miss disruptive innovations in their own industries. Their success creates institutional blind spots. Everyone inside the organization is pattern matching against what worked before. There's also an emotional component. When your identity is built around being someone who succeeded using a particular approach, suggestions to abandon that approach feel like attacks on who you are. Cognitive dissonance research shows that people will go to significant lengths to avoid information that contradicts their self-concept. If you see yourself as someone with good judgment, and your judgment has been validated repeatedly, new information suggesting your judgment might be wrong creates psychological discomfort that your brain instinctively avoids. This is why some founders step down when their companies reach a certain size. They recognize that the skills required to build something from zero aren't the same skills needed to manage at scale. That recognition requires an unusual degree of self-awareness, because it means acknowledging that your most deeply ingrained patterns might be obsolete. Most people don't have that level of metacognition. They experience the suggestion to change as resistance from others, not as a signal about their own cognitive limitations. Their brain keeps scanning for evidence that their original approach still works. And it usually finds some evidence because reality is complex, and almost any interpretation can be partially supported. The takeaway here isn't that you should constantly second-guess yourself or abandon what works. It's that success, by its nature, tends to calcify your thinking patterns. The more something works, the less flexible your mental model becomes. Not because you're being rigid intentionally, but because your brain is doing what brains do, optimizing for efficiency based on past results. If there's something practical in this, it's maybe just maintaining a small corner of your mind that asks, what if the conditions that made this successful have changed? Not as a constant source of anxiety, but as a periodic check-in. The question isn't whether your approach is working now. It's whether the reasons it's working now are the same reasons it worked before. Some people build practices around this. They deliberately expose themselves to perspectives that contradict their assumptions. They create structures that force them to evaluate alternatives even when everything seems fine. They recognize that their own pattern recognition system has blind spots that only become visible in retrospect. Others don't do any of that and still succeed because the environment happens to remain stable enough that their existing patterns continue to match reality. There's no moral dimension to this. It's just a description of how minds work under conditions of repeated success. The pattern exists. Whether it matters in any particular case depends on whether the world around you is changing faster than your mental models can adapt. Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. The cognitive pattern doesn't break empires by itself. It breaks empires when the environment shifts and the pattern doesn't.